Okay, it's good to be together again as we continue our Bible study. We're looking at our second passage. The title of it is God's Judgment on Human Sinfulness, and found in Romans 1:18 to 32. And remember, we were looking at the end of Romans 2, most of Romans 3, where all men are guilty. Now we're looking, all men are sinners. Now we're looking at God's judgment. Okay, so the question is, are we a sinner? And the answer, of course, is yes. No one can deny that they're a sinner, and God's word is very clear. Now God is showing why the judgment needs to come in Romans 1:18 to 32. So as an introduction, why the gospel is necessary. Now that Paul has delivered the final verdict that all are guilty, Romans 3:9 to 20, we move backwards to see how he began building that case. And he started with Romans chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth. Okay, and so it's the power of God unto salvation. Secondly, it's to everyone that believeth, the Jew first, and also for the Greek. And then the third thing, for therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith. And the last, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. So these verses introduce the main theme of the entire book of Romans, the gospel of Christ. Everything in the book of Romans points back to the gospel of Christ. This glorious gospel addresses humanity's core problem, sin. And we've seen that we're all sinners. And it offers God's righteousness to us through the finished work of Christ. So his death, burial, and resurrection. Paul presents this message in 4 unfolding truths about the gospel. And we sort of underlined those or highlighted those earlier. So it's the power of God unto salvation. The gospel is what leads to salvation. So it said, for it is the power of God unto salvation. It is for everyone who believes, both Jew and Greek. So he's making it available to all, to everyone. Okay? It reveals the righteousness of God from faith to faith. And this is interesting. So one will receive, it reveals God's righteousness, but how does it reveal God's righteousness? By faith. And we see only by faith. Now it is interesting because this expression, from faith to faith, so with this and this Greek preposition, from to, it only occurs one other place in the Bible, and it's Corinthians 2:16, where it says, from death to death, from life to life. The idea, once you're dead, you can't be any more dead, right? Once you're alive, you're either alive or you're dead. Once you're alive, you're alive. So from life to life, from death to death. What does it mean? It means only life, only death. Here, it's only by faith. All right? So we see it's the power of God. The gospel brings salvation. The gospel is for everyone who believes, and it reveals that righteousness of God in bringing salvation by faith alone. And then the last, as it is written, the just are those who are believers. The just will live by faith. Okay? So if you are a believer, then you live by faith in God. Your life, right? You were saved by faith and faith alone, and then that faith continues and it is the faith that you live by. What follows, Romans 1:18 to 3:20, shows why this gospel is not just good news. It is essential. One cannot deny it. All are under sin, and only the righteousness of God can save. Paul begins with the revelation of God's wrath, not his grace. Notice what comes after talking about what salvation brings. Romans 1:18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. The wrath of God, his righteous response to sin, not a mood, but a settled opposition to evil. God is so righteous that evil cannot come into his presence. God doesn't punish us because he gets joy out of it. God brings punishment to evil because he is righteous. There is nothing else that he can do. The wrath is directed at those who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Okay? So they have the truth, but they suppress it. Paul is not starting with the law, but with creation accessible to all. Paul begins his argument about human guilt not by pointing to the Mosaic law, which was given specifically to Israel, but to general revelation, that which everyone has, what God made plain to all people through creation. This includes God's eternal power and his divine nature. Then verse 20 we read, from the invisible things of him, from the creation of the world, are clearly seen, okay? Being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and his Godhead. So his divine nature, his Godhead, his eternal power, that he is omniscient, sovereign or all-powerful, omnipotent. Okay, so he has eternal power over everything. He's omnipotent. Number one, everyone has access to this knowledge because creation is universally visible. No one needs a Bible or religious instructions to see the sky, the mountains, the sun, human life, and ask, where did this come from? Anybody can do it. Okay. Anybody who is looking for why life exists, where did it come from? We all can ask that question. This approach makes Paul's argument universal from the start. In other words, his argument is for all people. First, we saw that we are all guilty. We are all sinners. Now he's showing to us that there's no excuse for not believing because we have creation around us and we can all see it. No one can say, I don't know, or I didn't know, because God's character is seen clearly in the created world. Which is one reason why man has come up with something other than God to create it, because they know there's a God and they don't want to put their faith in that God, and they don't want to put themselves under what they might call as God's restriction. The problem isn't ignorance, but suppression. People see the truth, but they suppress it. Romans 1:18 said, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all unrighteousness or ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who hold the truth in unrighteousness." That idea of who hold has the idea of who they hold the truth, but they hold it in unrighteousness, which means they are suppressing the truth. Right? They want to hold to unrighteousness, that the earth was created by a big bang, that there is no God. Why do they come up with those? Because they know there is a God, and they know that they're sinful. It shows that the wrath of God is just even for those who didn't receive the law, like the Gentiles, because they still rejected what was clearly revealed through creation. They cannot honestly deny that a God exists, and it's seen through creation. Paul is laying the foundation for the full argument that will stretch to Romans 3:20. All people are guilty. Jews with the law, the Gentiles with creation. In Romans 1:18-32, what we're looking at today really focuses on the Gentiles who had creation, not the law. But they had creation. They're denying the existence of God when he has so clearly shown himself. Romans 2:1-3:8 then moves to the Jews who had the law but still sinned. They were special, right? They have both creation and the law that was given to them, but they still sin. Then Romans 3:9-20, which we already looked at, says all are under sin. There are none who are inexcusable. By starting with creation, Paul shows that God's judgment is both fair and righteous. All men were created in the image of God. They have a knowledge of God existing, and creation just make them desire to know more about this God. Even before law enters the picture, it makes sin a heart issue, not merely a legal one. A legal one would come from the law, but a heart comes from creation, God revealing himself, God creating us in the image, in his own image. We are created to desire to have something, someone to worship. That's why we see all the false worship around us. God put in our heart that desire to walk with him and to believe in him. Okay? When we reject it, then we need to replace it with something else. And so it's replaced with false religions. Even somebody who's an atheist, that's their religion. That's what their belief is. That's why they argue for it so strongly. If they were truly an atheist, they could care less what we think. Right? But because they're not, it is what they believe, so that they don't have to believe there's a God. They argue very strongly. All are without excuse. General revelation and human rebellion. All right? God has made himself known, 19 and 20. Because that which may be known, okay, it's something that's knowable of God, is manifest in them. We were all created in the image of God. We all have a God-searching mind and heart. We were created with that to worship God. And then it says, for God hath shown it unto them. How? Not only is it in them, but he has shown it to them. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood. Okay, so the invisible things of God are clearly seen by creation, can be understood, even his eternal power and his Godhead. Man has an awareness, therefore he is without excuse. Okay. None of us can say, I didn't know. No one else can say, I didn't want that. No, we are without excuse. Man has an awareness, that which may be known of God in Romans 1:19. God's existence and his attributes are clearly perceived through creation. It says, from the creation of the world, they're clearly seen. Okay? His God's power and his divine nature, his Godhead and his power, right? They are clearly seen by things that are made, his eternal power and his Godhead. They're evident. No one is truly ignorant. Fourthly, human guilt begins with rejecting what they do know, so that they are without excuse. When one rejects what is revealed, then one has no excuse. If I tell you don't walk in the backyard at night because there's a big pit there and there's sharp spikes in that pit, and you go out and walk and fall in it, you're without an excuse. You knew, right, that it was there. Well, we know that God exists because we are created in the image and we have creation all around us. When we reject that, we are without excuse. A beautiful passage from Psalm 19:1 to 4a. And this is beautiful because it's really where Romans is getting its teaching from. It says, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. Day unto day uttereth speech, and night unto night showeth knowledge. Uttereth speech, showeth not, meaning it continually shows that God exists. Okay, there is no speech nor language where the voice is not heard. Their line, their message has gone out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. Creation is not silent. It proclaims something very profound. The heavens are not divine, like pagan cosmology suggests, but creation points to the Creator. It's not silent. Each day and night builds on the previous, creating an unending chorus of revelations. God's creation is like a perpetual sermon, always active, always speaking. Day unto day uttereth speech, and night unto night shows knowledge. Okay, it's a chorus of revelation showing God exists. God's revelation through nature transcends human languages. It is universal witness to God's glory, accessible to all people, regardless of culture or location. And verse 3 said that there is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. Their voice, the voice of creation. It's available to everybody. It shows God's glory. All people, regardless of their culture or their location. Creation's testimony is not localized. Okay? It reaches all people, showing God's desire that no one remains ignorant of his power and his majesty. Verse 4 says, their message has gone out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. And so they're without excuse. They know that it exists, but people choose not to glorify or thank God. Although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him. They knew him because we are created in the image of God, and he's within us in the sense that the desire for us to come before him, and creation, right? So they knew there was a God, but they didn't honor him as God or give thanks. Refusal to worship God leads to moral and mental corruption, sinfulness. Their thinking became futile, and their hearts were darkened. The great exchange, glory for idolatry, right? They exchanged the glory of God, his divineness, so the glory of the incorruptible God, right, the holy, righteous God, for images, for idols, for things that represented their gods that they could worship, but not the heavenly God, not the incorruptible God. Humanity created gods in their own image, which is why there is never found another redemptive God in false religions, because it's created after their own image, and we're all sinners. And so the gods of these people, these idols, they're sinful gods, right? They do evil things. And here, when they create the gods in their own image, they're reversing the creator-creature role. They're making the creature the important one, and the creator, they're not giving honor to him. Idolatry may appear as mere cultural expressions, but in reality, it is a fundamental rejection of God's sovereignty, turning one's back on the Creator who reveals himself by making us in his image and giving us creation to see his glory. God's judgment begins with giving them over in verses 24 to 28. God gave them over to impurity, into their sin. God gave them over to the lusts of their hearts, to impurity. In other words, God allows them to sin as much as they want. He just gives them over to their own lust and desires. God's judgment is not always fire from heaven. Sometimes it's letting sin run its course. And we look at the evilness. I can think of things that happen because of man being evil, right? We can think of mudslides. Often they are caused because of cutting down trees for mining rocks and not replacing it with something else to protect man, because that costs money. So greed, man is being punished by the greed of others. It lets sin run its course. Sin is always going to be bad and painful, and it's always going to have negative results. Okay? Sexual impurity is the first symptom of turning away from God. God gave them over to dishonorable passions. For this reason, God gave them over to dishonorable passions. Homosexual behavior is given as an example of unnatural distortion. Paul is not singling out a group. He is showing how rebellion against God distorts all life. Immorality, adultery, having more than one partner, right? These are all unnatural. That's not the way God created. In Genesis, it said God created man and woman to become one, not a man and three women, or one woman and three men, right? Not two men or two women together. It's a distortion of what God created, because he's allowing men and women to live in their sinful sexual passions. You say, but their desires are so strong. Yes, without God, their desires are strong. And if they're believers, then they need to rest in the power of God and desire what he wants for their lives. God gave them over to a depraved mind. For this reason, they did not see fit to acknowledge God. Okay, again, they knew God, they don't want to acknowledge him, so God gave them up to a depraved mind. The final stage, mental and moral confusion. They not only sin, but they approve of those who practice sin. So it's the idea, when they're sinning, they want others to do the same so they don't feel guilty. So they approve of the sin they're doing, and then they encourage others to follow. So the results of sin's reign, verses 29 to 32. A long list of sins are given there: unrighteousness, evil, greed, envy, murder, deceit, gospel, insolence, disobedience to parents. As we look at all of this, sometimes we're in that, right? What about gossip? Huh? What about a little bit of lying? Huh? A white lie? What about disobeying parents? We see all of these. So don't just choose one or two that we don't, I'm not a murderer, I'm pretty good. No, we have envy. We see it all the time on Facebook, the envy by what people post when somebody else posts something. Greed. Sometimes it's our posting of something that we got to do and we're showing we're greedy. It's ours, nobody else's. So we want to be careful, but we notice that these sins are everywhere and they're the result of facing our passion. And so we want to give our lives to God. Sin spreads in every direction. It's personal. It's just affecting me and God. It's social, affecting society, and it's relational, affecting husband and wife and children, and immediate families. This catalog is not exhaustive, but representative. Paul's not trying to give us a long line of sins, but he's trying to show us that we are sinful people. And nobody can say, well, I'm not in that list. No, yeah, we are. We're all in that list. We're all sinners. Hopefully saved by grace and growing more and more in sanctification and holiness as we learn more of God, but we're all there. Some of us are saved by His grace, others are still living in rebellion. Knowing God's judgment and ignoring it, though they knew God's righteous decrees. Notice how many times it says they over and over again. They not only do them, but they give approval. Moral decline leads to moral endorsement. This is the final tragedy, not just sinning, but celebrating sin. Key themes to connect with Romans 3:9-20. All of this is the background of Paul's later declaration. All are under sin. There is none righteous, no, not one. No one, not a single person, does good. Okay? It's impossible without faith. There is a divine diagnosis of every human heart. Okay? Every human heart is sinful. Sin is not just about outward acts. It includes the corruption of our hearts, our minds, and our wills. Totally corrupt. Every part of who we are has been affected. Romans 1:18-32 reveals that humanity has willfully rejected God's self-revelation, both in us and in creation. That idolatry leads to moral collapse. A society without God only lives more and more in sin. That God's wrath is already active in this world through giving people over to their desires. And that's why we look and say, how can people be so evil? Because God's giving them over to their own desires. That sin is both individual and cultural, impacting thoughts, desires, and society. Our summary statement. Paul's argument in Romans 1:18-32 reveals that all humanity has suppressed the truth about God, exchanging His glory for idols, and fallen into spiritual and moral ruin. Without God, we are hopeless. God's judgment is already present, okay? Not just in the future, but in handing sinners over to the consequences of their rebellion. This sets the foundation for Paul's later statement that all are under sin. and desperately in need of the righteousness of God that comes by faith. Faith in his one and only Son, Jesus Christ, God himself, fully God, fully human, who died for our sins, who was buried and rose again. And you and I, as his children, need to have believed that and accepted his death personally for ourselves, ours, and then we need to develop our relationship with him so that we're walking daily with him. And so the question as we go through this week, have we realized how sinful we are and how holy God is? Have we, or are we willing to give our life to him by faith and be drawn to him with a personal relationship, one-on-one, through reading the Word, meditating on the Word, and praying and becoming more like Christ? He said, "Be ye holy, for I am holy."